Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Neal Hudson, and I'm an independent housing market analyst and founder of BuiltPlace. Just a quick note to say that this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be available afterwards for you all to catch up on it. And so I'm delighted for you to join us today, and we're going to be looking at house builder profitability. And so in 2008-9, the housing bubble burst and house prices crashed and transactions fell sharply. The volume house builders weren't immune, as their business models back then tended to be dependent on debt and also rapidly rising house prices. Buyer demand disappeared, land values collapsed, and job losses hit the industry hard. As a result, house builder profit margins cratered and new home completions fell. But in the years since then, their margins have more than recovered, and shareholders have seen substantial returns. To discuss why, I'm delighted to introduce Dr Chris Foye from Henley Business School at the University of Reading and Dr Shepherd from the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. They'll be talking to us about their new research investigating why the volume house builders have been so profitable. We'll then be joined by Dr Sarah Payne from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield for a response to the findings, and we'll have a discussion before opening it up to questions from the audience. You should all hopefully be muted, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so with that introduction over, delighted to hand over to Chris and Ed.
Thanks very much, Neal. I'm going to, with Chris, to just give a quick summary of some of the key points from the report, which is published today on the Cash website. And then we'll kind of move on to the rest of the program. So if you click to the next slide, please, Chris. Yeah, so just thanks very much to Neal, BuiltPlace, Cash, Sarah, and everyone at Cash has helped kind of bring this report to fruition. It's great to be here today. What we're going to cover in the slides, first I'll just give a quick overview of the background, so the broader context as to why we've been looking at this question. Then I'll crystallize that into a kind of research problem that is kind of guided the research that we've done that's set out in the report. I'll give a quick overview of the methods that we've employed. And then I'll kind of just go a quick summary of one half of the theoretical framework that we've used in the research. I'll discuss the concept of structural power, and then I'll apply that concept to an analysis of the mortgage market support that was provided by the state to the volume house builders in the post-GFC period. Then I'll hand over to Chris, who will talk about the sort of land market competitiveness and market power, which is the sort of other half of the theoretical framework that we've used. And then Chris will end with some reflections to bring it all together and to look at the changing political environment that's shaping the volume house builders businesses at the moment. Next slide, please, Chris. So the background here is a familiar one to anyone probably that's here today. It's the rise of the big three house builders by volume. That's Barratt, Persimmon, and Taylor Wimpey. And a broader story of the concentration of the house building industry and the dominance of supply of new build homes in the United Kingdom by the volume house builders, the top 10 of which produce around 50% of new build homes annually. So that's kind of the story that's been well researched elsewhere, that's sort of guiding our research. Next slide, please, Chris. And so there's kind of two halves to the problem. One is we know that the big three house builders have been hugely profitable, abnormally profitable over the decade or so since the global financial crisis, as shown on this graph. And this was despite a very significant downturn in the fortunes, as Neal just outlined, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. But the profits they've enjoyed since then are well beyond what we would expect in a competitive industry. Next slide, please, Chris. So despite the significant political pressure to increase housing supply from the government in the years following the global financial crisis, and the introduction of various policy measures designed to support house builders in doing so, such as the mortgage market support schemes and various reforms to the planning system intended to liberalise it to encourage housing supply. The big three house builders have failed to significantly increase supply and have instead adopted a model of increasing their margins over volumes in order to generate larger returns from their development land banks. And again, this has been researched elsewhere, not least via the Letwin report. Next slide, please, Chris. So we're interested in this seeming paradox of how it is that house builders have been able to generate, or these house builders have been able to generate such large profits and have continued to enjoy such significant state support for their businesses, despite not significantly ramping up volumes to assist the government in meeting its housing supply. So in a nutshell, our research question is the one that's set out on the screen, which is, how have the big three been so profitable? What does this profitability tell us about the nature of the house building industry, the development land market, and the relationship between volume house builders and the state? Next slide, please, Chris. So to answer this question, Chris and I adopted a mixed method approach. So we conducted qualitative analysis of transcripts of the big three's earnings calls and investor day or analyst day presentation between 2007 and 2018. These are tend to be calls or meetings, events in which these businesses present their results and explain their business operations to the investors. So we did this in order to understand how the big three represented their changing business models and practices to those investors who would directly benefit from the dividends and share buybacks that would result from increased profits. So these transcripts also provided data regarding the big three's land buying activities and their perception of the degree of demand and competition for sites in the land markets in which they operate. And we complemented this qualitative analysis by conducting some quantitative analysis of various metrics reported in the presentations that underpin the earnings calls and the annual reports for the big three, as well as data sources from Refinitiv, which is a sort of financial markets data source. These gave insights into the financial and business performance of the big three over our study period. And we combined insights in this data to provide what we think is a rounded account of the business and the politics of the role of the volume house builders in the supply of housing over the study period. Next slide, please, Chris. So it's a key part of our argument that the big three, and we would argue volume house builders in general, were able to enjoy such abnormal profits was because of the state support offered to them, combined with their dominance of the development land markets in which they operate. So we theorized that this state support and market dominance was due to a combination of what political scientists call structural power and economists call market power. So we'll expand on these shortly when we go through our theoretical framework. So the report that we're launching today analyzes these forms of power by exploring the liberalization of the planning system, mortgage market support, and development land markets. Next slide, please, Chris. But for the purposes of this presentation and the interest of brevity, we'll really concentrate on mortgage market support and land market themes, although the liberalization of the planning system is there in the background, particularly when we talk about land markets. Next slide, please, Chris. So just to kind of say a few words about structural power, which is quite an important kind of theoretical concept for the research. So it's a concept with roots in political science and political economy. It refers to the power that's enjoyed by businesses as holders of capital, such that they have influence over states and politics due to their power over production and the creation of wealth. They can exert this power by threatening to withdraw their productive investment from economies, and by doing so, secure concessions from policymakers. So these businesses typically enjoy, a structurally privileged position in economies. So this concept, unsurprisingly, enjoyed somewhat of a revival in the aftermath of the GFC, the global financial crisis, when the major banks were bailed out by the state, by states. That these banks were perceived to be too big to fail by governments seemed to be a classic example of structural power. So we argue that we can think of volume house builders as also enjoying structural power. And this is because they have significant control over the productive capacity of the house building sector, a sector which produces a quasi-public good that is of extreme political, symbolic, and ideological importance, and was particularly so in the aftermath of the GFC and the years following, which have been shaped, of course, by the discourse of the housing crisis and the politicization of housing supply. So the state relies on a small number of businesses to supply a significant proportion of housing, as we know. And these businesses, due to their size, are able to manage build-out rates in a way that smaller house builders are not. They also have significant control in development land markets. They hold significant amounts of development land. And this means they arguably have monopoly control over those sites, certainly have monopoly control over those sites, if not the wider land markets. But as we'll explore towards the end of this presentation, the fact that these business models are rooted in specific plots of land in specific places means that they cannot exert the same kind of exit threat as, say, Google or Amazon can. So they can't just leave the UK if they don't like the prevailing political environment or the business environment that's created by policy change. But fortunately for them, their businesses have been operating in a pretty favourably political environment over the last decade or more, although this may now be changing, as we'll reflect on later. Next slide, please, Chris. So I'll explore structural power through looking at the example of mortgage market support and the schemes that were launched in the years following the global financial crisis. So the key ones are summarised on this table. I won't go into them all in detail. The report goes into them in more detail. But the main argument I'll make here is that those that were introduced after 2008 were specifically targeted at new build homes, and were all in various ways targeted at larger rather than SME house builders. So this was reflected in policy discourse, in the impact assessments and the business cases produced by the government, as well as reflected in the amount of funding that flowed to the volume house builders and the big three in particular. And there are some figures on the slide there. We would argue this is evidence of state actors perceiving that the volume house builders were in a structurally powerful position in relation to housing supply, and certainly in relation to helping to deliver the economic and political objectives of the government in relation to housing. Next slide, please, Chris. So the initial rounds of mortgage market support, so before Help to Buy equity loan, were designed sort of in part in a context in which volume house builders were struggling, as Neal summarised earlier. So they and their contribution to housing supply were perceived by policymakers to be at risk, and they were too big to fail in housing supply terms. So the objectives of these early support schemes was to incentivise VHBs to increase supply, of volume house builders to increase supply. So crucially, part of the incentive was to enable more homes to be sold at a higher price, and this brought with it, we would argue, the inflation of the new build premium, as indicated by this quote from the homeowners support package impact assessment that we were able to secure for this research. Next slide, please, Chris. So the policy discourse at the time was that the larger house builders were in particular in need of support due to their size and exposure to business risk. And this was at the expense of small to medium-sized enterprises whose needs were just not recognised in the same way. So the structural power of the volume house builders and the receptive political audience that they were sort of communicating with meant that they were able to influence policy in their favour, such as through promoting Home Buy Direct or the equity loan model that underpinned Home Buy Direct to policymakers who sort of duly took it up, as suggested by this quote from Lord Kerslake. So once state-backed equity loan schemes were adopted, this enabled volume house builders to wind down their own schemes, and in doing so, basically transfer risk onto the state. Next slide, please, Chris. And this kind of risk transfer continued in the Help to Buy years. By this time, volume house builders were not perceived to be at risk of failing. They'd started to enjoy pretty good profitability again, but they did continue to dominate supply and the land markets in which they operated. So the state continued to provide them with support in the hope that it would sort of incentivize them to increase build-out rates significantly. But as we know, this didn't materialize. Instead, volume house builders, the big three, continued to wind down their equity loan schemes and continued to enjoy an inflated new build premium due to the inelasticity of supply in relation to sort of the de-risk demand that was released by the equity loan schemes, including the Help to Buy equity loan scheme. So this, combined with their monopsonistic activity in the land market, which we'll discuss and define shortly, or Chris will, meant that they were able to extract sort of larger profits. Next slide, please, Chris. So I'll hand over to Chris now to talk about that term monopsony, which I just mentioned in relation to the market power of the volume house builders, or the big three in particular, in relation to local land markets. And in doing so, we will be reminded of the truth of this statement by Pete Redfern, who was then chief exec of Taylor Wimpey. We said we weren't just a house builder, we were a land portfolio company, that our main driving goal, our main way of adding value was adding value to the land bank taking it through the planning process. All right, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. I'm just waiting for the, there we go. So yeah, as Ed said, I'm going to focus on the other side of the the kind of circle there, on market power, and particularly how they use market power, and particularly their market power in the land market to kind of bring about their profitability. So when we think about the market power of volume house builders, and house builders in general, we tend to think about their monopolistic market power, that is their ability to influence a firm or group of firms to influence the price at which they sell houses. So when we think of that, particularly in terms of the Letwin Review, which talks about how they drip feed supply in line with local absorption rates, so as not to flood the market and reduce the price at which they sell properties. I think that's pretty much received wisdom now. Much less attention, though, has been given to their monopsonistic market power, which mean the ability of them to influence the price that they pay for inputs. And those inputs include labor, of course, they include materials, but arguably most significantly, they include land. And our arguments kind of is specifically that during the global financial crisis, or the years following the global financial crisis, they were able to, the volume house builders were able to keep down the price that they pay for land in the local areas in which they operate, specifically greenfield, large-scale greenfield sites, which they rely on. They were able to keep that price down despite house prices rising. And we can see that there's three real, I suppose, sources of evidence we use to document this. The first is kind of is a quantitative indicator. So if you look here in the yellow line is which Neal's kindly provided, and I should say that a lot of our analysis for this particular topic draws a lot on Neal's own excellent analysis. So I think it builds on it. So if you look at here, Neal's yellow line here, which is essentially a residual land model, and this is showing what the counterfactual. This is what we'd expect to happen to land prices, given what we see in terms of help to buy, also in terms of declining interest rates. If the land market was competitive, that is, if there were lots and lots of buyers and sellers or no barriers to entry, this is what we would expect to see to happen to land prices. The pink lines shows what is the Savills Greenfield Land Index, and it's showing what Savills land agents, based on their kind of subjective judgments about the land market at the time, and what they saw, what their perceptions of what was happening to the greenfield land prices. And we can see that there was around about the time of Help to Buy, around 2013, there was a dislocation there, as the land prices didn't keep up with the house prices as we'd expect. And we can see this in the house builders, the big three's balance sheets as well. So this is certainly not a perfect measure. And I should say none of our measures are perfect. There are no perfect measures of the land market because data is so poor, and because each land market is very, very different, and segmented by kind of the type of land, and as well as the location. But this is as good as we got. And this is also an indicator that the house builders themselves use to indicate their land costs, which it's basically looks at the cost of an average plot in their land bank based on what they paid, as a proportion of the average sales price in the previous year. And you can see again that this is declining downwards from 2013 and also before for the data we have based on persimmon. But you can see it for all since 2013 is a clear decline. Because house builders are spending less on land, it means that the proportion of their land costs as a proportion of the sales price also declines, which of course is brilliant for their profitability. But the final kind of aspect is the final indicator is qualitative indicators. And what we've done is we've gone through basically every reference to the land market in the Volume House Builders earnings calls. And you can, if you check out the appendix on the website, you'll see them all documented with a summary for each of the different years or 2 years. And they're remarkably transparent about the fact that the land market since 2014 or 13, the land market was much less competitive. And it stayed so until 2018. So I'm not going to read out all those quotes, but I think the quote from Jenny Daly there, kind of Group of Operations Secretary Taylor Wimpey, is probably most telling. Everybody in industry has been telling you for a number of years how much easier the land environment is, how much better the returns are, and how much less. Sorry, my little camera's in the middle. How much less competition there is. Okay, so how do we explain this this market power? Well, I mean, I think it boils down to supply and demand. So if we look at the supply side, we can see that since the NPPF in 2012, which of course a senior manager in Taylor Wimpey played a part in drafting that very piece of legislation. Since that was introduced, the supply of large sites, which is you can see is there in pink and also in the grey line there, they have both increased significantly, whereas the supply of small sites, which is less than 100 units, has not increased at anywhere near the same rate. You could even argue it's plateaued. And as we know, there are very large barriers to entry on those large sites, because you need to be able to hold land for a long period of time in order to build it out. You also need particular infrastructure to service those larger pieces of land. So there's very large barriers to entry, and that means there's very few people who are actually able to actually purchase them and actually use them, build them out. And again, we can go back to Jenny Daly here, who's kind of identifying that crucial role of the NPPF in driving the supply of land, and particular types of land. Leading to, in the last line there, reduced competition and consistently higher investment margins than we saw in previous decades. But that's part of the explanation, is that supply side. And also, and we can, as I said, we wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a mass increase in smaller builders and new entrants into these land markets because of their large sites and because there's big barriers to entry. But I think a more puzzling question, at least we find it more puzzling, is why the big volume house builders themselves didn't expand their supply, their demand for land. So I mean, if as we're saying, land prices are very cheap, then why did the volume house builders themselves not think, well, let's ramp up supply if it's so profitable? And there's a variety of reasons, we argue, why they were reluctant to increase volumes. I mean, there's the fact that if they increase volumes, potentially reduces the price that they can actually get for those properties, because it means they flood the market. Potentially they have to flood the market. There's also a degree of skepticism or kind of worry, concern about how long the housing boom would last, and a kind of a slight sense of doom about another housing market downturn. And of course, then they also wanted to return cash to their shareholders. And if they build more houses, if they expand volumes and expand the kind of amount they spend on land, it means less cash for their shareholders via dividends and share buybacks. But the key reason, another reason, is that if they were conscious, or at least Pete Redfern here, who probably knows more about, has more experience in the house building industry, UK house building than anyone, is that they knew that if they all expanded their demand for land, then given the limited number of them, it would mean that, and the limited amount of land, because land, of course, is fixed, it would mean that it would inflate the actual land values, and that would then compress their profitability as an industry. So just to summarize, we've kind of argued that the volume house builder profitability has really kind of built on three planks around planning negotiations, which we didn't cover today, but it's in the report. Mortgage market support, which of course boosted the price that they were able to charge for houses in the form of the new build premium, and also allowed them to shift their own credit risk onto that of the state, and also the less competitive land market, which kept the price of land down. And we've argued that they've been both driven by a combination of market and structural power. And you could also argue that this, to an extent, this loop is self-reinforcing, because we know that both the land market and the mortgage market were structured particularly to favour the larger house builders, which of course then makes the state more dependent upon those same larger house builders, which therefore potentially increases their structural power. I kind of, as a concluding reflection, though, we don't want to kind of portray this as a sort of inevitable loop of doom, where the concentration leads to further concentration and power, etc. Because I think there's a really crucial point here, that the state also has a crucial role, and there's a crucial role for ideas in politics and institutions. So I mean, in the downturn, there was, and in the recovering years as well, the state could have intervened very differently. The state could have shaped mortgage market schemes in a way that supported all house builders. The state could have shaped the planning system and the land market in a way that particularly favoured smaller house builders. And they had that agency. And when we're using the concept of structural power, I think it's also, there's two really kind of important points to make about this concept. We think it's a really useful concept for understanding the volume house builders' influence, but we also think it's a concept that needs to be used carefully and has this degree of ambiguity about it. So I think there's two important points. The first of all is the state has a significant amount of structural power itself. The state has control of the planning system. It has control. It can borrow money cheaper than anyone else. It has control of institutions. All these give it a significant degree of structural power itself. This is particularly true regarding the volume house builders because, as Ed said, the fact that they're heavily invested in land and particularly fixed geographic spaces means that they've got limited ability to move. They don't have that exit option that Google and Amazon, for example, do. The second really important caveat is that structural power is always signaled. Okay, it's not a fixed absolute quantity. It depends upon how it depends upon how it's a signal. It depends upon how it's interpreted. So, I mean, we know based on the kind of discourse we've analysed, we know that state actors it seems that state actors were extremely reluctant to intervene in a proactive, positive, direct sense to actually increase housing supply in the decade following that, and rather they were much more tended towards relying on the market, however imperfect it was. But that was an ideological choice. It was a political choice. And once they thought like that, then of course, if they were relying on the market, they were relying on the volume house builders, which meant that the volume house builders had structural power. But if they themselves had interpreted those signals in a different way and seen themselves as possessing structural power and recognized their own structural power, they could, for example, have purchased their own land banks when back in the depths of the crisis, as we've seen, land was cheap, and whenever we've seen they could borrow it at really, really low rates, much lower rates than the volume house builders. So I think, and indeed, some people were suggesting they do exactly this. So, for example, Toby Lloyd, Matt Griffith, or the IPPR, were all suggesting at that very time that there was this option for the state to actually take a more active. This was an opportunity for the state to take a more active role in the delivery of housing supply. And then just the kind of final point then is that it's just to kind of think about then what that means for today, because we are seeing lots of the echoes of the global financial crisis today. We're seeing the kind of volume house builders bunker up and kind of withdraw supply in the face of declining house prices. We're seeing we've seen them call for a new wave of Help to Buy and support in the mortgage market. We're also seeing of course another inquiry into the competitiveness of the house building industry. This time by the CMO, then by CMA, then by the OFT. But there's also signs that the ideology this time is slightly different, and there's a greater degree of skepticism, at least within seems within the Gove kind of led department of the competitiveness and the ability of the house building industry to actually deliver supply in which that's what's necessary. Albeit it's dubious whether there's sufficient indication that the state has actually displayed a willingness to take on it recognize its own structural power and deliver supply itself. So I think on that note, I'll leave it and stop sharing.
Thanks, Chris, and now hand over to Sarah.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Chris, and for the invitation to provide some reflections. So I just want to spend about 5 minutes providing some reflections on the report and the presentation. So I work in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at Sheffield as an academic, but I do want to add the disclaimer that I have previous experience in the house building industry as a land buyer pre-global financial crisis, and then as a property consultant during the financial crisis. So really, I just wanted to reflect on what the report highlights. And it is an interesting and useful analysis of how the industry was affected, obviously, by the GFC and was able to survive and seek efficiencies through this focus on ROCE, return on capital, and not necessarily volumes as previously done so. And in many ways, it does mirror some of my own research findings, in which I report on a series of elite interviews with Britain's biggest house builders on their recession and recovery behaviours. And the report also hints and highlights at some of the key strategies that builders use to assist really in maintaining purchase and securing their footing as recession and recovery played out. And it does draw on this very interesting conceptual framework to provide one interpretation of the dynamics primarily between the state and the builder, but also, of course, pulling in the mortgage and the land markets, these kind of wider institutional settings that are very important in understanding how this market-led housing system operates. The particular key findings of interest for myself, I think the report picks up on the importance of builders needing to generate cash, get it out of the ground in those early days of recession and recovery in order to reinvest in the business to then proceed on to growth and stability in the successive years. Of course, in controlling work in progress, controlling WIP. So builders, you know, if you're building plot 22, then you're selling plot 22, you're not selling plot 26. And also at this geographical and product preference towards arguably stable housing markets that provided opportunities for land purchase or pulling down strat land to enable the development of suburban greenfield-based family homes versus that, you know, peculiar policy context we had pre-recession of PPG3 building apartments in city centres very high in their capex. And of course, this reduction in the ambition for what we can call conventional growth. So we didn't find builders leaping back into areas where divisions were closed pre-recession. They were focused on, you know, building back capacity within the divisions that existed. And of course, some were moving out into new divisions where there was an ability to purchase land. And all this underpinned this focus on ROCE and not volumes. For me, of course, being an academic, I'm thinking about the gaps in knowledge that this raises, interesting areas of future research that I think need addressing in order to explore these issues that the report raises in more details. Of course, you know, a lot of house builders say to me, Sarah, this is not rocket science, it's house building. But, you know, I very much counter that and say the market-led housing system we operate in is very complex. There's lots of moving parts, there's lots of influences on the day-to-day business decision-making of house builders, and they seek to orchestrate all this. Particularly of interest for me is the changing motivations and agencies of landowners in the post-global financial crisis landscape, their role in perhaps having a greater say in the layout, the residual, and the negotiations with planners regarding obligations. And allied to that, the structure and operation of land markets. I mean, we know that the volume builders won't really ever compete with the SMEs in terms of the types of land that they're looking to purchase. So there's a role of the planning system to provide opportunities, not just large sites in order to achieve the kind of the housing delivery tests. And then a third point, and I think this has been picked up in the questions, having had a quick look, is the impact of other inputs into the residual. So the report, of course, focuses on land and sales prices, very important in understanding the issue, but we know at the same time there were issues around skills and material shortages, costs, Section 106 costs as well. So it would be interesting to kind of factor in those issues into looking at these explanations. And of course, finally, price setting. You know, how does this new build premium work, and how are prices set? And a final comment. I wanted to take the opportunity to think about. I mean, the report does a really good job of looking at how the state can, or what the state can do to bring a more responsive, environmentally sustainable and equitable house building industry. But I'd actually like to argue that it's the house builders themselves that should be asking these questions and trying to get ahead of the very obvious environmental and social issues we're really hurtling towards. And the answer, it won't be found in an economic or a power perspective. I think we need to recognise that builders perhaps have a moral duty to deliver homes and protect the environment. And then from this perspective, the question becomes, how can they differentiate themselves as a business to meet these complex needs against really a context in which the state might not be willing to do it and address those themselves. So these might not be magnanimous contributions. They may, you know, there's a place for mundane morality, but I think that's kind of a question that we should be pushing with the industry to get themselves to recognise the contributions that they can make. And they're kind of my reflections, and I'd like to hand it back over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, I've actually probably got the first question for you, based on what you've been talking about there. And we know that following the financial crisis, there had been an expectation that the regulation of house builders and new homes was set to increase, particularly with regards to environmental regulation. And as you know well, that was cut back significantly. And so I was just wondering if you had any reflections on how much that might have had an impact on what Chris and Ed have found, and perhaps if there's any feed through to what we're seeing right now in terms of policy approaches to the environmental regulation of homes.
Yeah, Neil, I think it's we can imagine all different scenarios that may or may not have occurred. One thing I will say is that having again done some research on the zero carbon homes target, developers were planning ahead. They were thinking about technological solutions, fabric solutions, and there's this missing kind of this view that house builders don't like regulation, and actually regulation provides an even playing field. And so consistent, direct regulation that's clear and has a time frame that the builders can work towards is a way in which we can shape the industry. In terms of the environmental regulations, the issue I think is that the state isn't giving itself a good reputation, in that if we see all the key environmental regulations, they have been watered down in recent years. And you can argue it leaves the industry in a bit of a sticky situation, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing in terms of buying land or organising land, optioning land today, what the costs of products will be down the future. They've got to do that planning themselves. But yeah, in terms of what may or may not have been said, or what may not have been used as levers, we can imagine various different scenarios. I don't have any evidence to say anything otherwise.
Thank you. Chris, you mentioned data and the lack of data on the land market, and it actually ties into a question here about whether there's a case for optioned raw land to be registered, so we've got a greater visibility. And I was reading the CMA sort of interim report earlier, and it looks like they've been getting hold of data on how much land the volume house builders own. But I was just wondering whether you had any comments about what that lack of data on the land market and the lack of transparency in the transaction process might play in this situation.
I mean, I think it's so it makes it obviously difficult for us as researchers to actually study the land market and make inferences about it. You'll note the chapter on the land market part in the report is full of footnotes, basically trying to kind of address a lot of the alternative explanations for those declining costs of declining kind of cost of land for the house builders. So I think there's one of them is section 106, which we address, and the others the cost of materials. I'm not saying they're kind of really substantive. I'm not saying they're kind of comprehensive in terms of kind of rebutting those points, but I think they're pretty substantive. So I mean, for researchers, it's tricky in terms of the industry as a whole. I'm not quite. I guess if you had greater transparency, it would make us better able to see kind of how the land market functions. Probably reduce the entry barriers a bit. I suppose in terms of the policy recommendations, I wouldn't see it as being a game changer, because I think where Ed and I come down to, I think both in this is that you're not going to see any substantive change to this house building industry until basically you get greater state, direct positive state building of housing, because you can diversify the industry, and we think that would generate support of that. But even if you diversify the industry, it's still, even if there's lots of small house builders, it doesn't take the risk away. It's still very risky to develop housing. So I think, and the only kind of body that can shoulder that risk, I think we would argue, is effectively is a state, and not necessarily building its own, but through through perhaps supporting custom build sector or supporting smaller builders as well, and making sure there's a diverse group of tenures. So yeah, in terms of the kind of land market transparency, it's an issue. Would we like better transparency? Yes. Would it improve the market a little bit? Would it make a big change? Well, I don't think not really. I don't know, but Ed might think. Sorry.
Well, I think you're right, Chris. But I think, as the questioner David Stewart suggests, the main benefit would be to give provide greater evidence with regards to the degree of kind of influence / control house builders have in local land markets, because as everyone who's present here will know, but it's worth re-emphasizing, when we talk about the land market, we actually are talking about specific segments of land markets or within which these volume house builders are dominant. So it would just help to have that evidence to see how much land in those land markets are controlled by XYZ entities, and therefore, again, how difficult that makes it for other entrants to come in and so on. I think that's something which is specifically addressed, Neal, as you mentioned in the CMA interim report.
Thank you. So during the presentation, you referenced Pete Redfern from Taylor Wimpey effectively calling his company a land portfolio company, and it's been said that the house building arm of house builders is just the way that they realize their core business, which is taking land through the planning system. And this ties into a question from Michael Edwards about would deregulation, if granted, boost builder margins more than output again like this? Or so if we were to deregulate the planning system, as there are some calls for, to increase the supply of land, what impact do you think that would have on the house builder business models and their profit margins?
I could take this one quickly, Chris, but I think there's a chapter in the report, Michael, which kind of explores this question, and we return to it in the conclusion. And I think it depends what you mean by sort of deregulate. But if we look at what happened in 2012 with the MPPF and the tilted balance and so on, what that did was essentially enable more sites of the kind that are preferred by the volume house builders to be released via the planning system, more often than not via a kind of an appeals-led strategy, which obviously favors better capitalized, better funded developers, and then produces a supply of land which can only really be developed by those same kind of developers. So if whatever people mean by the liberalization or deregulation of the planning system results in an increase in supply of sites which only a small number of developers are able to develop, then that's arguably going to have the effect that you describe, which is kind of what happened post MPPF, which it basically enabled a greater supply of these kind of sites to come through the system, which were then controlled and then gradually developed by the volume house builders, and contributed, we would argue, to the increase in their profit margins.
Thanks, Ed. I think picking up on that, and there's a question here about the new national planning framework for Scotland signalling a shift from greenfield development to brownfield land, and that's been a popular political topic for at least a decade, if not 2 decades. And I suppose the business model around brownfield development is very different. But are there any lessons from the research here, or is it a very different model that has different factors going into it? Anyone want to take that?
I could say a couple of words, Chris. Yeah, I mean, it's just to return to kind of the evidence base that underpins this report. It was we looked at the big 3 specifically. That they famously prefer the greenfield sites, and withdrew from brownfield regeneration or brownfield development in the aftermath of the financial crisis and so on. So we can only really speak with confidence about that. But in terms of sort of broader lessons to brownfield development, I think it's, for me, I don't know about you, Chris, but for me, it's such a different kind of development with different kinds of risks and different kinds of questions in relation to things like Section 106 liabilities and so on, that it becomes quite difficult to kind of transpose these findings onto brownfield development or kind of infill development.
Sarah, one of the things that the report mentions is the fact that because so much of the money was being pumped back into profits and dividends, that there's been a relative lack of research and development within the house builder model over the last decade. We've obviously seen some people move into the modern methods of construction, and particularly offsite modular manufacture. It hasn't gone brilliantly for everyone involved. You said earlier about them being sort of forward thinking and planning, but do you think they have you think they've been on top of everything that they should have done, or are there areas that they should have been doing more work on to deal with the challenges that they're facing now and in the future?
Yeah, I think it obviously depends what you mean by R&D and innovation. And some of the big builders do have these arms, and they have teams working, specialist teams working on, I guess, what you could argue would be policy priorities. So again, going back to the zero carbon homes target, all new homes will be zero carbon by 2016. Some of the big builders did have R&D facilities, and they were looking at Code 5, Code 4 solutions, because they have to. If the policy is directing them towards those places, then they have no other choice. Again, modern methods of construction are slightly different, because how you define that can determine whether you think the builders are working towards those practices. And I think again, it goes back to this point that builders will to some extent follow regulation, and so they will be looking to see, right, where's the policy landscape going. However, I would, and it points back to my kind of final comment on this morality issue is, you are beginning to see some of the big builders looking towards things like biodiversity, net gain, and green space on sites as things that aren't necessarily pushed through the planning system or through regulation, but are parts of their remit that are important in terms of, you could argue, corporate social responsibility. So I think, again, there's this, are they putting enough into R&D? Well, that to some extent depends on what journey we're going on. I think it'd be facile to expect a volume house builder to spend much more money on their product than their competitors if they're all operating in the same land market. Why increase your costs? Because it's only going to have one impact. And we know that the industry is fairly conservative in terms of its use of standard house types, but it has shown to adjust those in response to regulations. So I think there's a dual role there. There's certainly one of the government having more clear and consistent policy paths that have an impact on design, both of the fabric and of the layout of the site, and also on the builders to think ahead and think, right, what are the key environmental and social challenges, and how can we adapt our product to meet those needs? How can we increase biodiversity net gain? How can we increase the amount of green space on sites, healthy homes, all those sorts of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, Neal, I think just on that point, I think regulation's key as well in this respect. I think based on our research, we wouldn't expect the big three at least to ramp up innovation and R&D on their own volition. Where they make their margins is in the land market, and they make by bringing land through the planning system and building it out. But that land key component is key. So we can expect them to invest. I would expect them to invest significantly in land buying teams and to innovation in land buying, and bringing stuff through the planning system and networks and everything in the planning system. But I think because that's where the profit margins are. But beyond that, I think the kind of what our report is, and it's not a new finding again, but it kind of confirms is that they aim to be very conservative in terms of their actual investment in trying to improve productivity and to actually to leave more cash for shareholders, essentially.
There's a question here around the Letwin review and its findings about the link between absorption rates and differentiation. And so the question actually asks if the panel could comment on ways of taking the Letwin insights further. But Roger actually then goes on to talk about the particularly the bulk deals we've been seeing in the build to rent sector in recent months that have been helping to support the volume house builder sales rates. Does the panel have any thoughts on that? And I'm happy to step in as well and give my views on it as well.
I think it's fascinating, but I don't know enough about it. But I think it's a really interesting shift. But you know far more about it than me, Neal. I don't know whether Ed and Sarah have anything to say about it.
Well, so I suppose the key on larger sites is the differentiation, both in terms of product type, but also tenure and pricing will help to increase the overall rate of delivery, and particularly given the trend that we've seen post 2012 towards larger sites. I think in the more short term, we have seen some house builders begin to take a more active approach to selling to institutional investors, particularly as the build to rent market has moved away from what they would call the multi-family market, the high density city centre apartment market, to the single family rental market, so buying up family homes on new build estates. But not all of them have done that. Some of them have taken the full hit to their sales rates. Some have done these bulk deals either to the institutional investors or to housing associations to help them. But even having done that, they've taken a hit to the sales rates. But I think perhaps the most interesting one at the moment is maybe Vistry, who have they're in the process of actually completely changing their whole approach to house building and taking a much more partnership-led model where they're working in partnerships with housing associations and others. And it means that they are expecting a lower margin of return in the market. And so when their deal was done, they were maybe looked at by their peers, and their peers were maybe wondering what they'd done, shifting into this lower margin market. But I suspect there's a bit of envy now in terms of the deal that they got and where their model is. But I suppose the question is, that might be attractive now when returns are lower and sales rates are down. But if we do head back into a market where margins start rising and activity, completions and sales start rising, then maybe that lower margin model might not be quite so attractive again. So it's in process, and ultimately it's linked to the fact that we haven't actually seen a significant correction in house prices.
Sorry, Neil, this is not quite the same point, but just to bring it back to the report, it's just this conversation just reminds me of what was in one of the things that was interesting about looking at the transcripts in the years immediately following the GFC, and people that were around at the time will remember this. That there was a lot of relief amongst the volume house builders that we looked at, that they had agreed RSL sort of elements on their books that they could just build out and sell quickly to get cash through the business. They were in kind of survival mode at that point. Of course, fairly rapidly things switched to more of a let's try and renegotiate Section 106 obligations to improve viability and phasing and so on. But at the early stages, there was just get cash through the business on these kind of low margin parts of schemes. So yeah, not quite the same point, but something just bring it back to the report in the early years.
There's also echoes there with when we looked at the impact case study for the case for support for the first buy scheme, which was introduced by New Labour as well. One of the key things that they said, interestingly, for why the scheme, mortgage market support scheme, should specifically target larger house builders, is because the smaller house builders would be able to rent out their properties. They'd have a greater access to the rental market than the larger house builders who wouldn't be able to do that. So that seems to be a slight, it's quite interesting in that light as well.
There's another question here about whether it's surprising or not that the volume house builders have done nothing to generate a believable guarantee system, as in the sort of NHBC warranty system, to ward off the growing distrust of new homes. And I suppose that is linked into a broader kind of reputational question. As your research shows, the volume house builders have done very well over the last 15 years. They went through a period of getting almost everything they asked from central government in terms of policy, but they rewarded the public and policymakers with the leasehold crisis, the building safety crisis, the quality crisis, the bonus crisis. And so they maybe haven't done everything they could to manage their reputation, and the role is what sort of lessons, I suppose, I guess Sarah, from both the house builders but then also maybe from the policymakers, should we take from that period and the findings here, particularly in light of what we're likely to see as new calls for some version of Help to Buy in the autumn budget?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure I'd agree with Michael saying that I think it's unrealistic to expect volume house builders to do research. I think there is an expectation that they will, and that the product that they sell, must meet standards. Those aren't always met, and there are, a small number of builders who suffer reputationally because of that. But again, I think I do get a sense that there is this, and I think the report points to this growing distrust, as Michael states in his point, about new homes. And this is, again, where I'm beginning to look towards this idea of builders looking at their kind of moral reputation, their contribution to society, as a way to, I guess, encourage themselves to focus on addressing these issues that we have seen emerge. How this links to Help to Buy, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the where your question went in terms of that. If you could rephrase that.
Yeah, it's just whether there's questions for, and I suppose this is maybe for Ed and Chris, around for policymakers, the lessons that they might learn from the last 15 years or so, and particularly in light of any calls for a new version of Help to Buy this autumn.
I'll just come in on that briefly. So when I did the bulk of my research in, I think it was 2015, 2016, a good number of builders were looking to try and move beyond Help to Buy as a way of kind of, if you will, propping up their businesses. And so they were, I mean, I don't know to what extent that's relevant now, but they were thinking, right, how can we operate as a business without this support? How can this be feasible? And so there is this issue that because it's there, it's not necessarily desirable. They're just working with the system that is present. But of course, it has its purpose. But I'll pass on to other panels.
Do you want to take it, or yeah, I go. I think it's a really interesting point about how, at least in terms of the big three, and Ed might have a different perspective, but I think what's there's remarkably little, actually, in hindsight. We didn't actually know at the time that much, but there's remarkably little talking with their investors about reputation. They don't seem particularly concerned by it. It doesn't seem to affect their share price, or I don't know if it affects share price. It doesn't seem to concern investors. The kind of how they're, and I wonder whether as kind of policy wonks, we all have an interest in this. We kind of know, it seems all right, but I wonder to the average person on the ground whether it all drips down to them, and suddenly they think that I'm not going to buy from that house builder because their boss got massive bonuses. I genuinely don't know, but based on kind of the transcripts we read, it didn't seem to be concerning them, which imply it's not dripping down to the actual buyers. That kind of reputational damage. Yeah, Ed.
I think just very briefly, I just think your question just reinforces the power of the concept of structural power in the analysis. If you enjoy structural power and you have a structurally privileged and powerful position in an economy or in a particular segment of the economy, then you're not really incentivized to care too much about what people think of you, because you're in such a powerful position. And so I think it just feeds into the kind of the analysis that we've done. Obviously, as Chris alluded to at the end of the presentation, things are changing. There has been a shift, particularly under sort of Michael Gove, in terms of the discourse around house builders and house building, and the machinations of backbenchers during the course of the passage of the Levelling Up Bill through Parliament and so on. So things are shifting, and maybe house builders might start to care a little bit more about how they're perceived. But certainly over the period that we studied, it was definitely structural power all the way, I would say.
Thanks, Ed. And I think that's now 3 o'clock, so that brings our session to the end. So just remains for me to say thank you to Sarah for joining us, and thank you to Ed and Chris for talking to us about your research today. And thank you to everyone for joining us.